Hello and welcome. You're tuning in to the very first episode of the Somatic Enneagram Podcast.
That's right. We are excited to get started with an introduction to us as your hosts and then go deeper over the course of this season.
I'm Caryn Berley, an Enneagram coach living in Portland, Oregon.
And I'm Aaron Maines, a spiritual director living in Dallas, Texas.
We're both super excited about this podcast because we've been deep diving into the Somatic Enneagram for the last few years, and we're so excited to have you listening along to some of the powerful conversations we've been having about the key teachings that we're working with in our own lives and with our clients.
So whether you're new to the Enneagram or a seasoned explorer, this podcast is for anyone seeking profound personal growth and self-discovery using the somatic work.
In this first episode, you'll learn more about our stories, where we come from, our connection to this work, and why it's so important for us to bring it to you in this way.
We're going to unpack the power of the Somatic Enneagram, share personal anecdotes, and keep learning right alongside you as we go deeper into the teachings with our mentor, Marion Gilbert.
And later this season, we'll bring her on so we can all learn more from her directly.
All right, here's episode 1.
Well, here we are on the very first episode of the Somatic Enneagram Podcast. How's it going, Aaron?
Good. I have kind of a head cold today, so that's a good start to a podcast. That's when you should record. So just a fair warning is my voice is going to sound better as more and more episodes of these go. But I'm Aaron Maines, and I'm here with Caryn Berley, and we're excited to start this podcast.
Yes, it's so exciting to be finally getting this out there. The Somatic Enneagram work is something that we've both been really interested in for the last few years, and we're so drawn to continuing to flesh it out for anybody who's interested in really deep transformational work. So we're going to be hosting these conversations with our mentor, Marion Gilbert, in this first season of the podcast. And we thought we would introduce ourselves first so you know who we are and how we came to the Enneagram and where we're coming from as we host these conversations. If you found your way here, we imagine you either have heard the word Enneagram before or you've heard the word somatic before, or maybe even both. So we want to say a little bit about what this podcast is going to be like, but we're also really open to exploring how it takes shape and letting it be emergent as we go. But starting with the Enneagram is a system of personality structure, and it really describes the ways that our ego patterns take shape and how we get caught up in an identification of who we think we are and how we lose sight of who we truly are. And it is a really deep and vast system, and we are not going to be providing a basic overview of the Enneagram in this podcast. If that's something that you're interested in, I have another podcast called the Enneagram Typecast. But for this one, we're really looking at the somatic component, which often gets missed in standard Enneagram teachings.
The word somatic has its roots in the idea of the body and in sort of our being and in our body. So when you put them together, the Somatic Enneagram works as the expression of both essence and ego within our body. And it truly is the work of the full expression of the Enneagram as we understand it in the way we operate in our day-to-day lives and our present moments. While we won't expressly go through type by type, in this podcast, you will hear conversation around how different types function through the work of the Somatic Enneagram. And so if you're someone who comes to this podcast from the somatic place and you're interested in how that works with the Enneagram, you're welcome. If you're someone who comes to this work from an Enneagram place and you're interested in how that works in the somatic space, you're also welcome.
Yeah, you're definitely in the right place. And everyone, regardless of Enneagram type, has a body. We all have a heart and a head, and these are the centers of intelligence that the Enneagram outlines. And we're going to be focusing on the body because it is so easy to skip over and to think about the psychology of somebody and to think about the emotional experience for somebody, when in reality, what we have been learning from our teachers and our explorations is that the root of our fixations, the root of our delusions about who we are is actually playing out through the impulses and the compulsions that we are experiencing in the body. And there are all sorts of ways that we contract against our own life force, and we don't get to show up fully as who we are. So, we're here to share what we've learned and to have conversations about how do we work with the body so that we can get to the root of what's going on here so we can actually show up differently in our life, not just think differently, not just be less reactive emotionally, but actually be undefended and receptive to life moment by moment by being present in the body. So, who are we to be talking about this? We're going to introduce ourselves a little bit. And Erin, if you want to get us started, if you want to share about who you are, where you come from, and how you came across the Enneagram.
So I grew up in Texas and grew up in really in fundamentalist Christianity and have had my own deconstructing process coming out of that in and have found myself doing work for the last 5 or more years as a spiritual director. I would say the Enneagram probably drew me to that, actually. I didn't really want to do counseling necessarily, but my work and my role in the world is as a pretty spiritual person, a spiritual leader. It's one of those things where I certainly have been in scenarios where the person cutting my hair probably at the time overshared with me, and now they're crying and telling me their life story. And I'm like, it's been an hour and this haircut is going long. So part of that has just been my life of how, even as a five, somehow I am open to people telling me their stuff. And so that was a big part of me getting into becoming a spiritual director, using the Enneagram to help people seek wholeness. I first heard the word Enneagram in a bar in Nashville, Tennessee. A friend of mine who's a counselor, he was just like, "Have you ever heard of the Enneagram?" And at the time, this was probably 15 years ago, I was like, "No." And so then I took a test, right? And so the test said I was a five, and that test was not wrong. I know now that sometimes taking a test isn't, really the best idea. But, I lived in Nashville at the time because I worked in the music industry and I worked in marketing and promotions for record labels primarily. The Enneagram really just caught me at a really good time of my life. And I've just stayed open to spirituality, to the Enneagram, and I continue to do that work today. I don't still work in music. I reached sort of a moment, a career moment of what am I going to do from here? It was kind of in that moment of what am I going to do sort of post that career that I got into this spiritual space. And I love it. And I love sitting with people one on one in group settings any number of ways. And so using the Enneagram has certainly opened that world up.
Can I ask when it dawned on you that the Enneagram had made such an impact on your life and how it led you to seek out more of a spiritual role in not only your life, but with others?
There's a saying about like it read my mail, and that's what it felt like. I know some people struggle with figuring out their type, and I certainly didn't struggle. It's like it knew exactly who I was in like the most creepy way. And so I was obviously really compelled by that. But when I could first see that I had these patterns in my life that were not getting me where I wanted to go, or more or less they were preventing me from actually feeling good, that's when I knew some of its real power. And then in the somatic work, that it's more than just an idea. The somatic work has been about it started as my own work, and my own transformational work has been ongoing now for over 20 years as a process of really just a deep exploration in myself and an openness to God or the universe and how that works in my life, how the spirit of all of that draws me in and calls me to more. And so it's just been a real exploration of all of that for me. And this somatic work gives voice to so much of that, even back to my childhood and into my adult years. And, I'm in my mid 40s now. So allowing that to just be present in my life and allowing my life to be reshaped. And, and we jokingly talk about voluntary suffering. And sometimes it certainly feels that way. And so I love to talk about it and love to be with the work with myself and with other people. Well, okay, so that's a little bit about me. How did you come across the Enneagram?
Yeah, I came across the Enneagram by somebody telling me incorrectly what they thought my type was. Turned
Always
out.
fun. Always fun.
So I think I did a quick Google search. It didn't really do anything for me, and I texted it to my partner at the time, now my husband, and he immediately identified his type, and then we didn't talk about it for a while. And a few years later, was pursuing my own career in social work, and I was in graduate school, and I was, you know, doing counseling with people and really aware of so much suffering in the world and working with populations of people who were in chronically under-resourced situations. And I started realizing that I was absorbing way too much of that in myself, and it was really hard to function, and I didn't know how I could continue on that path. And so I sought out my own therapy, and it was a whole kismet situation of hearing about the Enneagram on a podcast as I was driving to therapy, going into session, and my therapist brought it in. And I also did not have a hard time identifying my type. I lead with type 9, which isn't necessarily common for type 9s, but I think I was ready to learn something that was actually gonna make a difference in helping me live my life in a way that wasn't totally exhausting. I knew something w wasn't working, and on the outside, I was getting a lot of positive feedback about how it seemed like everything was working out fine. And to get to understand that that was actually the way that my type, my ego structure was showing up, preventing me from feeling seen. I grew up not very religious. My lineage is Jewish and pretty secularly Jewish in my family. There's some rituals and things, but the spiritual component wasn't something that was heavily discussed. And so I got into my inner work through a very psychologized frame of mind. Um, I went to college and I became a peer counselor, and I started learning some foundations of active listening skills and feeling how nice it was to feel understood and learn some of those tools. And and then dealing with my own mental health struggles and eventually wanting to serve more people with those tools, I went into social work. So I got my master's in social work, and I started working with my own therapist through some of the challenges that I was facing coming into the world and trying to be my own person and figure out what that looked like, professionally and internally, and not really realizing, as somebody who has been fairly self-aware, or at least that's what I've been told and experienced, how much of myself I was totally unaware of. And that's what the Enneagram started to show me, like, "Oh, this is what's actually happening inside, not some idea of why I might be suffering or struggling, but really some deep wounding." And the universality of the human condition was so apparent in how I learned the Enneagram. So there was such a beauty to it in that there's not a randomness that I was afraid of, the chaos of, "Oh, well, maybe you're just feeling all these things and there's no reason for it." And so I got captivated by the Enneagram and wanted to learn all about it and started listening to podcasts and reading books, and I was kind of surprised to find that a lot of what was out there was rooted in uh, Christianity and Christ language, and it just didn't really resonate for me. So I started seeking out other places and other ways to learn about it, and came across some beautiful teachings that really began to allow me to open up to the spirituality. The Enneagram gave me some language for, like, learning that I merge with people and that I'm not really available to myself with my own presence in
Mm.
my own body. It's something I'm still unpacking and is getting deeper and deeper of recognizing, even after doing a lot of inner work, how that shows up so automatically. And by the time I realize it, it's been happening. I've been overwhelmed. And this is language from the somatic work that I've gathered more and more. But really, the Enneagram took hold. Like, it was so spot on for me that I wanted to know more about the other people in my life. In work situations, I would start to notice, and then with
Mhm.
my friends, I would notice certain patterns, and I would think, "Oh, I wonder if this is what's going on for that person." And just, it helped me be more curious about what was happening under the surface. So, gaining more compassion.
Right, so I know that you come from a counseling and social work background and sought out and have finished the narrative Enneagram training. And so how are you working with both your narrative training and your somatic work today?
Yeah. So just wanting to get this to more people because of the impact that it's had on me. I pivoted in my work and I left the agency situations I had been in and started my own coaching practice. And so I've been working with people through a three-centered process for some time now, going off of what I've learned in various, Enneagram trainings that I've been seeking out for the last few years. Where I first connected with Marion Gilbert was through the narrative Enneagram. And so finding out more about what she was doing, I started studying with her, and it's where Erin and I got connected. And we've been on this journey now for a few years of learning not just the framework of the Enneagram, but the individual experience of how these structural patterns arise in the body and what to do with that. It wasn't until I came across Marion that I started recognizing that there was a big piece missing in the ways that I was working with the Enneagram, because I knew there was more than tips and tricks to this. There's a lot out there about, like, what you do if you're this type. But coming across Marion's work and getting to work with her directly invited me into a different level of presence with myself and with other people. So currently, that's showing up in the very nitty-gritty day to day. How do I notice when I am having a sensation in my body? And how do I bring myself to a place where I can not exacerbate the patterns that are already keeping me from being more of who I am? So when I notice going down those pathways of thinking, "This is who I am, this is who I've been, this is how this is gonna work," my mind has a lot of ideas about how things should be, and learning to recognize how that shows up in my body. So that's really what I'm been pretty passionate about these last few years. So we're so excited. We've been experimenting with this. We've been in some really deep places, had some really profound experiences that have honestly been life-changing. And that's why we want to share more of these principles with you and get Marion's voice out there to folks who may be considering that the Enneagram has a lot to offer you, but not really knowing how to do that deeper transformational work.
Yeah, for me, the somatic piece of the work is an actual physical work, and it is something that is experienced in the body. And so I lead with type 5, and so I'm certainly a head type, and I suppose will be for the rest of my life. But learning that I'm not stuck there. I liked the way the use of the word stuck. Learning that I'm not stuck in my head is really what this process has taught me. And being able to move down out of my head to understand that I have intelligence and wisdom in other parts of my being that has been huge for me. And what it has looked like for me is an expression of emotion primarily. I started therapy a couple of years ago with my current therapist, and I told him I just don't have a lot of vocabulary around emotions. And even today, I would say I still have kind of a limited vocabulary, but even just doing the somatic work, I just have a deep sense now. I have a broader way of expressing myself. I have a deeper understanding. I allow myself to be vulnerable, which as a 5 is not something that I really ever wanted to do before. It felt like a dangerous thing to be out in the world and to be open. And so now, after doing this work, that is not so scary to me. So I live a life that is less fearful, and I feel more alive and open and broader than just, I don't know how it is for everybody, but they always say, like, when you're first learning your Enneagram type, like, the one that sounds the most painful is probably the right one. And even now, when I read type 5 description, I'm like, that doesn't sound good at all. But I also know that everyone is a broader expression of their selves than just what their type is, and that is really what doing this work with Marion and then on my own as well, and then working with other people in, being able to sit with other people, as Caryn and I both do one-on-one work with people, and so being able to do this work and watch people experience new beginnings, and they find themselves in new capacities that they didn't know that they would have before. That is just an amazing thing to watch.
Yes, I think so much of what people see the inner work as being is mental. You hear a lot about mindset shifts, and even the concept of self-awareness often lives in the head. And it's a great place to start to get language around what may be going on inside. That's certainly where I started. But I found the true work is whatever is coming up right now that we need to not only be aware of, but actually be present to in the body. And so I lead with type 9, which is technically a body type. But if you had asked me at any point in the first couple of decades of my life about my body, I would have very little to say to you, very unaware of what was going on for me internally. And learning about not only my type pattern, but the felt sense of experiencing my own body in real time, which is what this work has done for me, has been invaluable. And you mentioned aliveness, and that is such a good word. And it's a kind of a body center word. So we have all three centers, all of us, but there's this sense of being able to be more here and more alive that I see show up in all my relationships, my relationship with myself,
Yeah. Yeah.
and of certainly with my clients who I do this work with, allowing their own aliveness to surface and to get to work with it and get to see what is asking for our attention at any given moment. So this is ongoing lifelong work that I know I will be doing the rest of my life, and I'm really grateful to be in my early 30s, coming to this work now with hopefully a long life ahead to get to explore more and more of myself internally, because that also helps me truly be with there's so much suffering in the world, and the overwhelm of that is something I've experienced without knowing it in my body my whole life. And so to be more in myself also allows me to take clearer action on how I want to contribute to having less unnecessary suffering. And you mentioned voluntary suffering. There will always be suffering, but to get to choose to do the inner work so that we can really contribute to a world that we want to see in the future.
Yeah. So somehow a 5 and a 9 have found our way to doing a podcast where we talk about uh, moving inside of our bodies, which on some level feels a little unlikely, but here we are. And so in this first season of the podcast, we are just going to spend time talking with Marion openly about what all of this work is. And so, Caryn, what are you excited about just in this conversation?
Yeah, well, this is the main conversation that I wanna be having in my life, so it's wonderful to get to have it with you and to get to share it with people who are also curious about how do they actually show up in a body in this lifetime and do deep work so that they can have more experiences and be really present for them. So I'm really excited to first just to get to spend my time this way. It's such
Mhm.
a gift. And then really for continuing to untangle and clarify some of these concepts that sound very simple sometimes. I know the first go around, I was like, oh, okay. And the deeper that we go, there are so many more layers. And the more in my body I am, the more I start to see different threads that I want to pull forward and highlight and have recorded to revisit so that the deepening can continue. What are you
Yeah.
looking forward to with this?
Well, I watch a lot of cult documentaries, I have to admit it, and one of the things that I love about Marion is that she doesn't really want to be a guru in that sense, but she is such a great teacher, and she's very patient, she's very sometimes she's very forceful, but she's such a great listener, and so it's really a cool opportunity for me to have gotten to spend a little time with her and ask the questions that I've had and listen to her, and she just has this amazing way of being with people in a very present way, and so to get to do that on a podcast, I'm actually excited for more people just to get to hear her voice, to get to hear her and to get to ask the questions and flesh out some of the ideas, and honestly, I'm a little nervous that she's gonna turn it on me in the podcast, because that's really what she does. She just has this present way of like, "Can you notice how you're asking that question?" And so, no promises that I'm not gonna cry during this podcast, but this work has been so valuable, and just getting to do it and getting to be in the conversation with her, I think is a big part of that of what I'm excited about doing this podcast. So, letting that out into the world in a broader way, because this work is so opening, and to be able to put the somatic work in practice, even in a really quick way, just opens people up, and it's really beautiful to watch.
Yeah, it has totally changed my conversations with friends, with my clients, with myself, because this movement inward, inside, to see what's really happening here and now is not something that most of our ego structures are open to doing. And that voluntary suffering, the vulnerability of getting radically honest about what's arising in the moment that I don't feel that I have control over and that may feel overwhelming to look at when we have grounded presence, when we have teachers like Marianne, when we have spaces where we can really show up and get exploratory about ourselves, it shifts the whole way that we hold our identities. And this to me is that spiritual practice, the spiritual journey is becoming more and more clear on the patterns that are running within me and becoming more and more clear that that's not all of who I am, and
Yeah.
recognizing where I've been totally identified with that to the point where I don't even wanna let go of the identifications
Mhm.
because
Yeah, yeah,
it feels like safety, and yet going into these experiences, finding a new sense of what it feels like to be at peace at home in my own body has been the work for me. So I also don't know what to expect, but I'm so excited to bring this conversation forward. So hopefully you can tell by the way that we're talking about the inner work and doing it as more of a spiritual practice. This is not your run of the mill Enneagram podcast where we're going to name all of the words that have to do with each of the types. It's really more about this missing link to deep transformation. Erin and I met through the somatic work, and so we've come together now to be in conversation about how the work is showing up, and I
mhm,
really
mhm.
see that we come at it from pretty different angles, and yet we have this shared language and this experience to be able to relate to not only how do I stop suffering all the time so that I can, you know, get my life on track, but also what is my place in this world. We're going to be inviting on Marion Gilbert, who is the mastermind behind this somatic awareness work that combines her understanding as a physical therapist and as a spiritual seeker and as an Enneagram teacher for decades. She has agreed to let us, as her students and companions, invite her to share more about this work that has touched each of our lives so deeply.
Yeah. So in upcoming episodes, we'll be talking about what the practice can look like, what some of the vocabulary around this work is. And then I know Marion will take us to deep places. And what I really love from an Enneagram perspective about this work is that it comes from the lineage of people, the work that Marion has done over the years with people like Dr. David Daniels and Helen Palmer and many others, and how it continues to find, with Marion's guidance, continue to find a new expression. And there's so many people now getting into this work in the world via internal family systems or somatic experiencing or any number of these things, but none of those have this overlay or this lens of the Enneagram to them. And so, all of that other somatic work is really, really good work. But for many of us who, once we know the Enneagram, we can't unsee it, right? We see all the somatic work through the Enneagram work, and that is, it has just made all the connections for me. And so I'm excited to share that with so many people. And yeah, we'll pick it up next time.
Yeah, we'll be right here for the journey, hosting the conversations, asking our own questions and asking clarifying questions. And we're so happy to have you along on the ride. So welcome to the Somatic Enneagram Podcast. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Somatic Enneagram Podcast. You can learn more about Marion Gilbert, her teachings, and sign up for her training modules by visiting mariongilbert.com or somaticenneagram.com. The Somatic Enneagram Podcast co-hosts Caryn Berley and Aaron Maines are both trained in the Marion Gilbert Method and work with clients in person and online. Head to the show notes to learn more. Help us grow this podcast by subscribing, leaving a review, and please share it with your friends. Until next time.